Hello, everyone. Welcome to our winter lunchtime lecture series on life and science, human lives in the history of the biosciences, both inside and outside of the lab. I'm Megan Piorco, an Ellington postdoctoral fellow at the Science History Institute. It's my honor today to introduce our speaker, Emily Henri, historian of science and philosophy. Before I do, though, I'll say a bit about the format of today's lecture. Emily will be speaking for about 25 to 30 minutes, after which we'll have 15 minutes for audience Q&A. You can send in your questions during the talk using the chat function here on YouTube. You'll just need to log in and we'll be collecting the questions from the chat for the speaker. You can also email us your questions at lunchtimelectures@sciencehistory.org. Now, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. Emily Henri received her PhD from the University of Leeds in January 2020 and co-edited The Past, Present, and Future of Integrated History and Philosophy of Science, published in 2019. Emily is currently under contract with Basic Books to write the first biography of Henri Bergson in English. Welcome, Emily, and thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your work.
Hi. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be somewhat here with you today. Thank you very much to the organisers at the Science History Institute, and thank you, Megan, for hosting and for that introduction. So I'm going to be telling you about the main results of my PhD dissertation, which was about a French philosopher, Henri Bergson, and his reception among biologists. So in 1907, Bergson weighed in on one of the important issues of the day, biological evolution. With his fourth book, Creative Evolution, he transported the theory of time, duration, he'd been developing since the late 1880s, from the realm of psychology into the realm of biology. And so Bergson spent over a decade writing Creative Evolution. And during this time, he read the cutting-edge biological research of his day. In the book, he used an image, the élan vital, translated as vital impetus, to represent the unpredictability, spontaneity, unity, and branching nature of evolution. This book propelled him to international fame. It was rapidly translated into several languages, and it became a worldwide bestseller. In the years leading up to World War I, his lectures at the Collège de France in Paris and also abroad caused scenes of collective frenzy. His lecture theatre drew hundreds of people each week, more than the room could contain, and people ended up climbing up the side of the building to listen in. A lecture he gave in New York in 1913 famously caused the first ever traffic jam on Broadway. So, unsurprisingly, given his immense fame and the subject matter of the book, his bestseller, Creative Evolution, Bergson counted many biologists among his followers. However, historians of biology have generally minimized or ignored the different ways in which biologists read Bergson, which is surprising given Bergson's extremely wide reach and the biological subject matter of his best-selling book. So a recent take by Nicholson and Gorn is quite representative of this. They write, most biologists did not bother to discuss Bergson's views, not even to criticize them. One reason for this misconception is Bergson's use of the notion of the vital impetus. This cemented the association between his name and a controversial label with a complex history, vitalism. So Nicholson and Gorn in the same article write that nowadays to publicly accuse someone of harboring vitalist views amounts to condemning them to the scorching fires of scientific hell. And this partially explains why current, in particular Anglophone historians and philosophers often ignore or disregard Bergson and his contributions to the history and philosophy of biology. But in my research, I found that Bergson's legacy within biology is of much greater importance than the current historiography suggests. So this project was at the crossroads between history of science and history of philosophy, and it aimed to provide a much needed study of Bergson's reception among biologists, which in turn serves as a backdrop to reassess the complex interplay between philosophy and biology in the 20th century. So in this talk, I'll start by saying a few words about Bergson and his philosophical project, and then I'll present some of the biologists who are inspired by him, and then I'll draw a few conclusions. So I'll start by talking a little bit about Bergson and a few aspects of his philosophy. So Bergson is known as the philosopher of duration. He first expressed this idea in his doctoral thesis, Time and Free Will, published in 1889. And in this book, he argued that science has always provided a distorted picture of time and motion. In order to measure or even talk about time and movement, science has to borrow from a category that's external to time, space. And so time is confused with space, and movement is confused with immobility. The idea of duration therefore rested upon Bergson's realization that when it came to the notion of time, mathematics and physics were far removed from reality. And he believed that philosophy, if conducted correctly, would be in a position to capture the true mobile essence of reality. In Creative Evolution, the book I've already mentioned, as I said, he came up with what he called an image, a metaphor, the élan vital, vital impetus, to represent the unpredictability, unity, and branching nature of evolution. And I've missed a few slides, so that was an important point. Time is not space. And then so here's Creative Evolution. So he devised, so he had the metaphor of the élan vital. He devised a theory of the origin of human intelligence, according to which our intelligence has evolved in such a way that it is badly equipped to deal with things like evolution. So according to Bergson, our intellect is good at dealing with immobility and solidity. Our intellect has come about through the development of human technology over the course of evolution. So it's good at dealing with inert matter. It's good at dealing with quantity. It's good at dealing with space and practical problems brought about by material obstacles. But it finds itself often stumped when presented with mobile, fluid realities like life, like consciousness, like time. So when we apply our intelligence to these fluid, mobile realities, we treat them as though they are inert. We apply quantity where there is, in fact, quality. And that's the only way that we can obtain practical results. Bergson believed that this was necessary. It's necessary for scientific practice. But in doing so, when biologists apply these materialistic methods to life, they miss something essential about life. But luckily, according to Bergson, intelligence was not the only way of knowing reality. And it was not our only access to reality that had evolved. In addition to practice-oriented, problem-solving intellectual knowledge, humans were, according to Bergson, capable of a disinterested form of knowledge that he called intuition. He then later regretted using this term because it confused a lot of people. But one way of describing it is that it would be life knowing itself from the inside. Bergson's goal was to obtain philosophical understanding of the aspects of reality that intelligence was poorly equipped to deal with. But the idea was never, however, to replace science with philosophy or to discredit the findings of scientists. Philosophical knowledge would never allow for the practical results of science. And it was precisely because it was not bound by practical requirements that philosophy could discover some things about life that biology could not. So Bergson remained convinced throughout his career that philosophy and science were complementary, that progress in our understanding of the world would arise from a more metaphysical kind of synthesis, a synthetic effort. So in my dissertation, I argued, among other things, that it's above all this idea of a synthesis, which attracted 20th century biologists. And this will become apparent, I hope, in the second part of the talk and the conclusion. So I'll turn to the second part now. I'll talk about some of the biologists I studied. In my dissertation, I concentrated on Britain, but like Bergson's fame, him being read by biologists was a global phenomenon. For the purposes of this talk, I've divided things between two early 20th century debates. So first, what I call the vitalism mechanism debate, and then secondly, debates surrounding evolution. So unsurprisingly, perhaps, given Bergson's theoretical commitments in creative evolution, we find many biologists looking to Bergson for arguments against mechanistic explanations of vital phenomena. In the early decades of the 20th century, many biologists were expressing concerns about the use of the methods and concepts of physics and chemistry within the life sciences. So these biologists criticized the mechanists, who claimed that biological phenomena were best explained by reducing organisms to their physico-chemical elements. And so the anti-mechanists believed that the mechanists failed to account for the many complex specificities of life, such as reproduction, interactions with the environment, reactivity. And they feared that not only it was a bad heuristic for biological research, but also that it would result in biology losing its relatively new institutional autonomy as a science, and it would become a subdiscipline of physics. So these debates are sometimes represented as an opposition between mechanists and vitalists. So on the mechanistic side of the spectrum, there on the extreme mechanistic side, you would have German embryologist Jack Loeb, who in 1911 argued that ultimately life can be unequivocally explained in physico-chemical terms. And then on the vitalistic side of the spectrum, you have another German embryologist, Hans Driesch, who looks like he's very disappointed in everyone in this photo, and whose experiments on the development of sea urchins led him to believe that embryonic development was guided by a dynamic teleological, immaterial, and internal agency that he called the entelechy. So Nicholson and Ghorn, who I've already mentioned, argue alongside Stephen Jay Gould that Loeb and Driesch were special cases, and that most early 20th century biologists did not hold such extreme positions, but rather adopted a middle ground position. Chemical, but they did not. This didn't mean that they accepted some kind of untestable, immaterial, vital force. And on this point, I agree. I agree that most biologists were sort of in the middle. But what I don't agree with is how then this is used to draw conclusions about Bergson's reception. So for various reasons, including the fact that Driesch himself published a favorable review of creative evolution, Bergson and Driesch have been, for over a century now, read as identical. Bergson's vital impetus has been equated with Driesch's entelechy, and we know from Bergson himself that this association is far from straightforward, but it continues today. And Nicholson and Ghorn write, Bergson and Driesch were the last outspoken advocates of a dying creed. So because Bergson has been traditionally depicted as one of the chief vitalists, narratives like the one presented by Nicholson and Ghorn have presupposed that most biologists therefore rejected Bergson as some sort of theoretical extremist, and that those who did engage with him were not very important because they were followers of a school of thought that was already bound for obsolescence at the time. But what I found by looking closely at the works of biologists from this time is that among the biologists who turned to Bergson to find ammunition against physico-chemical reductionism and mechanism, many of them are precisely those who saw themselves as proposing a third-way view. So neither full vitalism nor full mechanism. And their approaches rarely invoke the vital impetus, but instead they were interested in other arguments that Bergson presented. So one of them is Bergson's idea of the temporality of organisms. This was used as an argument for the irreducibility and therefore the irreducibility of organisms and therefore the autonomy of biology. Biology had to be independent because there are phenomena that only the methods of biology can study. So for instance, Edward Stuart Russell, an important thinker of 20th century theoretical biology, wrote, an organism is above all a historical being, this fundamental fact alone is enough to absolutely distinguish between the biological and the physical sciences. In organisms, the past is always interwoven to a certain extent with the present. We could say, borrowing Bergson's expression, the past is extended into the present. Therefore, living beings must be explained by their history. And we find the same idea and the same Bergson quote in the writing of biologist and science writer John Arthur Thompson. Another idea that biologists liked, anti-mechanist biologists liked, was the one I've already mentioned, the idea that, according to Bergson, intelligence is characterized by a natural incomprehension of life. Biologists use the idea that there is an evolutionary explanation for the mechanistic inclinations of our intellect, and that biologists should somehow resist this inclination. So this is an idea that is found within the two biologists I mentioned before, Edward Stuart Russell and John Arthur Thompson. But it's also, more interestingly in a way, found again, he used this as an argument for the autonomy of biology. He called creative evolution the greatest event so far in the history of thought in the 20th century. And he adapted this idea central to Bergson's philosophy of life. So according to Derbyshire, scientists reject any theory which follows the fluid and mobile inclination of reality and are naturally drawn to theories which follow the natural mechanistic inclination of the human intellect. And he went one step further than Bergson, and he wrote in 1915, "We have therefore an argument for the view that the acceptability of a theory is evidence not of the accuracy with which that theory fits the phenomenon, but of its remoteness from it." So Bergson's evolutionary explanation of the limitations of human intelligence could be used, according to Derbyshire, as a criterion for deciding between good and bad theories. The fact that we find a theory appealing should alert us to the fact that this theory is probably far from the true nature of things. So this is something that Bergson never wrote. So this is going further than Bergson. But so these are biologists who are interested in Bergson, not because they're into vitalism, but because they think that their science needs new philosophical foundations for it to be able to maintain its autonomy from the physical sciences. So now I'll look at questions surrounding evolution. So the big neo-Darwinian movement of the 20th century that came to be known as the modern synthesis, which simply put designates the combination of Mendelian genetics and the theory of natural selection, and that came about through a collective international effort between the 20s and the 40s, is often represented as a mechanistic enterprise, and it's therefore seen as incompatible with Bergson's philosophy of life. It's worth noting that it's true, there were many 20th century biologists, some of whom I've already mentioned, who did use Bergsonian creative evolution to argue against the Darwinian picture of evolution. I don't have time to go into detail here, but I would be happy to say more about them in the questions later if people have questions about that. I'd like to concentrate on the more surprising case of Darwinian Bergsonian. It's more surprising because the way that the historiography represents Bergson as read by 20th century Darwinian biologists is that Bergson had little to no impact on them, or that if he did have an impact on them, it was during their early career when they didn't know any better. And one exception, a very important exception to this, is an article by Jean Gaillon, which I think is going to be translated into English at some point. But so this idea, so not Gaillon's view, but this view that Bergson had no impact on the architects of the modern synthesis, is very much how Julian Huxley is depicted. So Julian Huxley is the British zoologist, the science popularizer, He's the grandson of Thomas Huxley. He's the brother of Aldous. And he's the person who coined the expression modern synthesis in his 1942 book. And so he's a great example of, he goes completely against this way of representing Darwinism in relation to Bergson, because I found that he adapted Bergsonian ideas, and he injected them into three of the main themes he developed in his career: progressive evolution, eugenics, and animal behavior. I'll only have time to look at the first point. So in 1912, Huxley published his first book, The Individual in the Animal Kingdom, in which he developed his theory of progressive evolution. And he acknowledged that his ideas were heavily inspired by Bergson's philosophy. Writing in the introduction, "It will easily be seen how much I owe to Monsieur Bergson, who, whether one agrees or not with his views, has given a stimulus, most valuable gift of all, to biology and philosophy alike." And so in this book, Huxley dealt with the philosophical problem of individuality from a biological perspective. He thought that Bergson had done a good job of addressing this issue in creative evolution, because rather than proposing a rigid definition of individuality, Bergson characterized it in terms of tendency. And so Huxley paraphrased Bergson and wrote, "The major portion of this book is devoted to showing that living matter always tends to group itself into these closed, independent systems with harmonious parts. So one of the main tendencies of life was to strive towards wholeness, a certain form of internal harmony by which different parts of the system work together towards the conservation of the whole and the kind." And so Huxley linked evolutionary progress to his conception of individuality. Progress could be measured through the individual's independence from the environment. The more options an organism was able to consider and choose from in any given situation, the more independent it was. And this was especially achieved through the complexification of the nervous system, through the different parts, a sort of division of labor. So these were themes that Bergson had explicitly developed in Creative Evolution and summarized in a 1911 lecture that Bergson gave in Birmingham. It was the Huxley lecture. It was the lecture named after Julian's grandfather and titled Life and Consciousness. And so 30 years later, after this first book, in Julian Huxley's famous book, Evolution, the Modern Synthesis, I would argue that Huxley maintained the Bergsonian elements of his progressive evolution, even though he's more critical of Bergson by this time. In his book, if you read the final chapter, you will find the same depiction of evolutionary progress as in the book he dedicated to Bergson 30 years earlier, long after any supposed shift to more serious Darwinism, a shift away from Bergson. The main difference with Bergson is that Huxley sees natural selection as the motor for creative evolution, which is not Bergson's case. But other than that, the things that he takes from Bergson, they remain. And so, as I've said, there are other aspects of Huxley's appropriation of Bergson's ideas, which I don't have time to develop, but I'll just say that Huxley's career is marked by his prolonged commitment to a certain vision of eugenics. He was a vocal member of the British Eugenics Society, which he presided in the later stages of his career. And he explicitly linked the idea of Bergsonian creative evolution to the idea of humans taking creative control over their own evolutionary future. And this is not something Bergson himself had envisaged. And Huxley also used Bergsonian ideas about evolution to think about how to study animal minds, in particular in a paper about great crested grebes that's still considered important today in animal behavior studies. So here we have Huxley's most important ideas heavily informed by Bergson's theories about life and its evolution. And yet Huxley is still used by historians of biology as a kind of key example of anti-Bergsonism among biologists. And one of the reasons for this might be a now somewhat famous passage in a 1923 article, Progress, Biological and Other, in which Huxley describes Bergson as a good poet but bad scientist. And he argues that the vital impetus is as bad an explanation for evolution as the élan locomotif would be to explain the complex engineering of a train. So, however damning this critique might appear, several elements should draw our attention to the fact that this 1923 article does not represent a repudiation of Bergsonism. So in the same passage, after calling Bergson a bad scientist and just before deriding the explanatory power of the élan vital, Huxley praised Bergson's philosophical insights, writing, Bergson's intellectual vision of evolution as a fact, as something happening, something whole, to be apprehended in a unitary way, that is unsurpassed. He seems to see it as vividly as you or I might see a 100-yards race, holding its different incidents and movements all in his mind together to form one picture. And so his comment about Bergson being a good poet should not be taken, should not be understood as a sarcastic attempt to discredit Bergson. It's on the contrary to be taken quite literally. Bergson is a good poet. Huxley himself had been writing poetry since his teenage years. 1923 essay opens with one of his own poems in which he muses about his own intellectual vision of cosmic as well as biological evolution. And in his personal notes from around this time, Huxley referred to the élan vital, the vital impetus, as a useful descriptive term whose evocative powers bear witness to Bergson's talent, his poet's eye, he writes. But the vital impetus is too vague to convey matters of cold fact. And the explanation for evolution can be found in a form of Darwinian pressure. But before coming up with the phrase modern synthesis, I believe Huxley had operated another synthesis between Darwin and Bergson. And this was summed up by Huxley in one of his own personal notebooks, which I was lucky enough to be able to see. All his papers are in Houston, because he worked there briefly. And so one day I was looking at his notebooks and I found this scribbled on the page: great is Darwin and Bergson his poet. So Huxley did not favor Darwin over Bergson. For him, the élan vital described what was in need of an explanation, the progressive movement of evolution. And Bergson's philosophical vision stretched beyond biology and provided insights into evolution understood as a universal movement, as well as into the purpose and meaning of human life, its future. Darwinism, on the other hand, provided much needed scientific tools to explain the general trends of progressive evolution made visible through the philosopher's eye. So science could inform the poetic insights of philosophers, while Bergson's philosophical methods could inform science by giving direction to scientific research. And I'll say a bit more about this in my concluding remarks, but this is very similar to what Bergson's project was and how he envisioned the relationship between philosophy and science. So just a few words to conclude. It would be wrong, I argue, to say with Nicholson and Gorn that most biologists were not interested in Bergson. Many biologists adopted and adapted Bergson's philosophy in the context of their various areas of research. And the word adapted is important because, as we've seen with Derbyshire and Huxley, they often took liberties and they often went further than Bergson would ever dreamed of doing. It can't be said either that the biologists who liked Bergson only liked him because they were the representatives of the last representatives of this sort of dying vitalist tradition. This is certainly not the case with Huxley. It's not the case with Edward Stuart Russell. It's not the case with other thinkers who I haven't even mentioned, like Ronald Fisher, who's another very important 20th century modern synthesis architect. Jean Gaillon and John Hodge have shown that one of Fisher's obsessions was to show that evolution was creative, meaning non-deterministic, and that he used Bergson to some extent to do this. Another sort of non-vitalist who's into Bergson I haven't mentioned is Conway Lloyd Morgan, who was an important animal behaviorist, and he's the one who came up with the notion of emergent evolution, or at least who theorized it famously in the 20th century. And he attributed in part this to Bergson as well. One of the main conclusions of my dissertation was that one of the reasons Bergson has been ignored by historians of science is that 20th century science is still being read as a time of extreme specialization, a time when the separation between science and philosophy was becoming definitive. And I think perhaps what some historians are failing to see is that many scientists were actually actively resisting the trend towards specialization. People like Huxley, Derbyshire, Russell, and others, specialization needed to be resisted precisely because they were biologists, and by its very nature, by the nature of the research it involved, evolution, the nature of heredity, animal behavior, etc., biology was a philosophical science. It needed to communicate with philosophy. It shouldn't specialize away from philosophy. And so this joins part of Bergson's project in creative evolution to produce a synthesis between metaphysics and science that would account for the complementary and nature, but also the profound difference between the two forms of knowledge. And so I argue that this is what resonated most with the Bergsonian biologists. These biologists were themselves synthesizers of knowledge. They drew upon ideas and methods that were external to biology, arguing that only through closer cooperation between philosophy and science would the key problems of their discipline be resolved. Bergson's philosophy of life provided these 20th century biologists with the intellectual tools to integrate philosophy into their scientific research. So to these thinkers, Bergson had raised the status of biology not by making it more like physics, but by making it the most philosophical of all sciences. Biologists' enthusiasm for Bergson, therefore, as I said, clashes with a certain representation of the 20th century as the era of extreme specialization. And so this calls for an update of perhaps of certain conceptual frameworks for understanding this period. So I think taking Bergson seriously gives us important insights into the complex relationship between science and philosophy in the 20th century. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Emily. That was great. So I have some questions, but we do already have a few questions in the chat. So I'll go ahead and read some of those off for you. So Nathan Deeger asks, do you think Bergson's third way between vitalism and mechanism can provide important philosophical insights for 21st century biology and evolutionary thought?
I'm always a bit in trouble when I get questions about anything to do with current biology because I just simply do not know enough, and that's maybe something I need to remedy, because I always get really interesting questions about how Bergson relates to current biology, and I just never feel like I have the authority to respond properly. But I'm going to go on a limb and say, sure, I'm sure there are interesting things to find in Bergson. And actually, there are people, I think, looking into this a little bit, and I could think up some references and maybe leave them in the comments on the video or something, I don't know. Because there are people actually looking into this who are not me. Sorry for that.
Thanks. Yeah, just to sort of piggyback off of that, like, I guess in a broader sense, do you think that biology would benefit from bringing in more philosophical approaches? And maybe like, how could you see that happening? Because we did have a couple questions about that.
Sure. I guess the thing that is very noticeable today if you compare science popularizers in the early 20th century, like Julian Huxley, like John Arthur Thompson, they're all saying we need closer cooperation between science and philosophy. They're all sort of trying to think about ways of doing that. And then you look at science popularizers today, like sadly Richard Dawkins and even Neil deGrasse Tyson. They're saying things like, oh, people are just going to get bamboozled and confused if they have to deal with all this philosophical rhetoric. And this seems to be something that stems back to, Rimeric and Alice, in her book about Bergson and Einstein, kind of argues that this view that scientific knowledge is superior and more important and can exist on its own independently from all other forms of knowledge, can kind of be pinpointed back to certain choices that were made around the time Bergson debated Einstein, and that Einstein was seeing as having won the debate. And so I don't really have an answer as to how science and philosophy can be better integrated today, but I think it's interesting to look back at the history of that, because we can see that in the not too distant past, we have people who are very serious, who are very respected, and who are very seriously saying, as scientists, it's our duty to be philosophers. I think it's interesting to look back to the reasons why that just went away. Why biologists not only no longer felt like that was something that they could say, but sort of violently reacted against that. Because if you look at any one of the many tweets that Richard Dawkins shares again and again, he often shares the same. He'll say stuff like, philosophers didn't come up with natural selection. That's a serious indictment of philosophy as a discipline. Hashtag Happy Darwin Day. It would be interesting to sort of really retrace how we got to this point, where people like that are being applauded for saying stuff like that. I don't know. So sorry, it's kind of non-response. But
no, I thought that was a great response. Thank you so much. That was very interesting. So Abraham H. Gibson asks, is the characterization of Bergson and Driesch as vitalists a fair characterization, and did they accept the label?
So it's a really tricky question. I think Driesch is normally labeled a neo-vitalist because vitalism has a really complicated and long history, and so I think the neo is to distinguish him from maybe the 18th century doctors who were vitalists, and maybe some people before them. The thing about the relationship between Bergson and Driesch, again, really complicated, but Bergson does not label himself a vitalist. He explicitly distances himself in Creative Evolution from Driesch's form of vitalism, saying that it's useful in the sense that it points towards major problems with the sort of mechanistic way of thinking. So the sort of negative side of the argument, of Driesch's argument, he endorses, but he would not go so far as to endorse Driesch's picture of life and vitalism. And so the thing that's tricky is that Bergson does use this image of the élan vital, but it is, he insists, a metaphor, an image. It is a metaphor that he says he's taken from the physical world, because an élan in French is something, it's the idea of taking a sort of runner gathering up steam to jump. It's to give the idea of the original impulse of life, to give the idea of the general movement of evolution. He thought that this image, this metaphor, contained enough sort of smaller images to give an idea of the picture he was trying to paint, but he is not like Driesch, trying to do experiments on organisms to prove the existence of an entalpy or an élan vital. So that I think the problem is that the methods and their projects are extremely different, and it's so to say that they're doing the same thing is just not true. There's actually a really good article on this precise point by Tano Costeraro. I don't know if it's out yet. I think it's going to be a chapter in an edited volume where he discusses precisely and really well the question of the metaphors in Bergson and how this all relates to his vitalism and the difference between the élan vital and the intelligence. And again, I can find the reference and put it up somewhere because it's really worth reading, and I hope it's out. I'm not sure it's out yet. And there's also going to be a conference organized by the Ghent University on the question of Bergson and vitalism. So that's worth looking up because they're going to be discussing all of that.
Great, thanks. Next, Jake Jackson asks, do contemporary philosophers of biology take up Bergson's third way, and would Bergson help the current debates on function and dysfunction?
So I'm quite surprised at how I feel like in the Anglophone world of philosophy of biology, you very rarely hear mention of Bergson. And the reason I always pick on Dan Nicholson, who I think is great, but the reason I always mention his article and his critique of Bergson, and I always use it as an example of what I disagree with, is because as someone who's worked closely with Dupré and these people who are into the whole process thing, I think they're a bit quick to disregard Bergson as I think they don't look at him, they don't take him seriously enough, and I wish they would. And I'm kind of trying to figure out there's lots of speculation about why Bergson is not taken seriously and sort of how historically this happened. But I really think in the English-speaking world, this was largely down to Bertrand Russell just really sort of massively taking Bergson down, not only when Bergson was still alive, but then also in his History of Western Philosophy, which was a bestseller. And but so I don't find much. I don't find much reference to Bergson in current scholarship, and I've also found myself in situations where when I was back in Leeds, someone was giving a talk on something like metaphysics of pregnancy and talking about sort of processual dynamics, and I was heavily reminded of some Bergsonian idea, and I ended up just reading a passage out of Creative Evolution to the speaker who had never heard of Bergson, and I just find that really interesting and intriguing. But again, I kind of use the same excuses I used about contemporary biology, as in I'm more of a historian than a philosopher, and I don't engage directly with current debates. But I do observe that there's not he's not taken as seriously as I think he should be. And I think philosophers need to get past this view of him as a kind of wacky vitalist, because actually there's a lot of really interesting stuff about biological individuality, about all these questions that are still very discussed today.
Thanks. Arlen Stoltzfus has a question. Mechanistic biologists interpret élan vital as a mechanism and are disappointed in its emptiness. How would you explain that differently?
I would say that if you're going to look at the élan vital as a mechanism, you can only end up being disappointed because it is precisely not a mechanism. It's not even a concept. That's the reason Bergson prefers images to concepts, is because he finds them to be a more fluid way of using language. So I don't really know how to respond to that other than saying, of course you're going to be disappointed by the emptiness of the élan vital if you're trying to. I don't think Bergson was trying to tell any biologists that they should be looking for an élan vital in their empirical research. As in, he was not. Bergson was doing something a lot more subtle, that was to try to put us on the track of a sort of intuition of life that is not where all these parasitic kind of spatializations and the ways in which we are not able to sort of see beyond the ways in which we spatialize, the ways in which we mechanize things. He was trying to suggest a different way of looking at life that was precisely not what biologists are doing. So you can't, yeah, I would just say, yeah, don't look at the élan vital as a mechanism.
Okay, thank you. Brian Page asks, some of the debates seem to boil down to the determination of whether evolution operates at the level of the individual or the species. Do you think that's relevant?
I do think that's relevant. I don't really know what to add to that. Bergson would say that, in a sense, if it weren't for, if you imagine evolution as a big wave of freedom, which is what the élan vital is meant to represent, fighting against, but also coexisting with sort of material obstacles and determinations and determinisms, then if the élan vital could live on its own, you could almost imagine evolution happening throughout one individual. But because of the material limitations, we have this branching, and branching is usually the sign of obstacles that had to be overcome throughout evolution. That doesn't answer the question at all, but it just made me think of that. So, but yeah.
Great. So Kirill Potapov asks, one criticism of Maturana and Varela's autopoiesis is that it suggests individuals are closed self-referential systems. Would Bergson be on their side, or on individuals, or are individuals porous systems for him? Excuse me.
Can you repeat the definition from Varela, please? The beginning of the question.
Yeah. One criticism of Maturana and Varela's autopoiesis is that it suggests individuals are closed self-referential systems. And I think the question is like on the screen too, if you need to.
Oh, right. Sorry, I didn't see it. Okay. Individuality is never complete. Biological individuality for Bergson holds in itself its own antithesis, in the sense that organisms are never fully individual, and they're never fully because they tend towards reproduction as well. So for Bergson, you have to think individuality in terms of tendency. There's a tendency towards a greater, perhaps, harmony as we get more and more complex individuals with more and more complicated parts. That tendency towards individuality takes the form of a greater harmony. But there's it's impossible. Because it's a tendency, it wouldn't make sense to think of individuality as completely closed, and this is precisely the type of problem that emerges from applying static concepts to something that is in fact fluid. Once you're able to look at life beyond these spatializations, beyond these ways of making them static, then you can see that it's possible to have these seemingly contradictory things, like organisms or individuals, but they're constantly dividing and they're constantly changing. Yeah, I don't know if that answers, but I would say, yeah, I kind of lost the thread there, but yeah.
Okay, well, we're almost out of time. I'm going to ask the final question, if that's okay. And it's maybe about popular reception, but it could also be about like his peers, biologist reception. I was wondering if you found any evidence in like first editions in the margins of his texts about how readers were interacting with the text, and maybe some like ordinary people that would pick up this book, or who would that audience be? And do you have any evidence of their reception of the text?
I mean, it's the reception is a huge. It goes in so many directions because, as I said, this book was just at one point everyone was talking about it. Does that mean that everyone was reading it? I'm not sure, but yeah, I'm trying to think back to sort of material evidence that I found. But some of my favorite stuff I found, which didn't have anything to do really with my PhD research, was to do with political applications of this idea of creativity and freedom. And there's I'm forgetting the name of the author, which is really annoying, but there were a lot of women who used to read Bergson, and he was mocked for this quite a bit. It was used against him, but there's a woman whose name is going to come back to me as soon as we end the conversation, so it's very annoying, but who wrote a kind of an article about sort of feminist applications of Bergson's thought, which I'm not sure he would have necessarily agreed with, but she was sort of saying that she was talking about these notions of creativity and freedom, but also saying that it is because it's feminine in nature. She was agreeing with the people saying his philosophy was feminine, but to say that's a good thing actually, and that's why it's great. So I found all sorts of really fascinating things like that. I found some really, I was talking about Conway Lloyd Morgan earlier, I found some really detailed notes that he'd taken reading Creative Evolution. He really carefully read it and sort of, so it wasn't the book itself that had been annotated, but it was his own notes that are available. I think it was at the University of Liverpool. And that was really fascinating because he's one of the people who were critical of Bergson, but then also incorporated a lot of his stuff into his work. So yeah, among the biologists, I found lots of really fun stuff, but then as soon as you branch out of it, you just find loads and loads of things because it was just a hit. Like the book was a massive hit, and everyone was sort of taking what they wanted from it. And then, yeah. Sorry, that went in lots of directions, but I don't.
No, that was really great. It's great to hear about a feminist reception of it as well. Somebody asked if the woman whose name you forgot was Elizabeth Gross.
No, it's so annoying. I'm really.
Somebody else was Marian Cox.
Oh yes, that's it. Yes.
Okay, cool.
Thank you. That's it. Yeah.
All right. Great. Thank you so much. So it looks like we're out of time for questions today. I'd like to thank Emily again for a fascinating talk. Thanks for being here with us today.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, this talk is part of our winter lunchtime lecture series, streaming every Wednesday at 1 p.m. Eastern. The final talk in our winter series will be given by Megan Raby, Associate Professor of History at the University of Texas at Austin, on Working Naturalist, Episodes in the Life of Marston Bates, Life Scientist for Hire. Please join us for that next Wednesday, March 24th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. For more from the Science History Institute, including updates on all of our virtual programs and events, you can follow us online. We are at scihistory.org on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Thank you all for joining us today. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you next week.